Hello everyone, I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RealClearPolitics. Welcome to RCP's Poll Position, a new podcast where we talk to the nation's foremost experts in public opinion surveys as we head into the 2024 election. We're going to start this week with Spencer Kimball. He's the director of polling at Emerson College. Spencer, thanks for your time. Appreciate you joining us.
Tom, thanks again for having me.
All right, so Spencer, let's start with some of the basics. For people who may not be really in the weeds on polls and how polls work. I know I get this question a lot when I go out and talk to folks. So what is the most important thing as you sit down to construct a survey when you're trying to gauge public opinion, whether it's about, the election, horse races, or anything else? What's on your mind? What are the most important things as you construct a survey for people?
Well, Tom, as we teach in the classroom, there's really four aspects to the survey process. One thing that we have to consider is what mode of data collection are we going to use? Are we going to call people? Are we going to text message people? Are we going to send them emails? And how do we get their contact information? Some people go online, some pollsters, they collect people off of social media sites where you might see a pop-up ad to take a survey. And so the modes of data collection is one thing that we have to consider. And part of that is what state we're living in. So in states like Indiana or Montana, you can't use IVR polling. That's the automated data collection where you press your touch tone keys to answer the survey questions. In other states, text messaging is becoming more prohibitive. So each state's got these different rules that also might impact what modes we're able to use. And then the second part we have to look at is the audience. Who are we sampling? And that has changed dramatically over the last 40 years. And what used to be called random digit dialing, called RDD, they just randomly call people in the neighborhood. Well, that changed because cell phones came about and landlines were no longer, it wasn't so consistent, area codes and routing numbers. So we've seen a lot of what's called stratified sampling. And as we get into what we're looking at in the 21st century is something called panels, where people have opted in to some of these survey groups. And they get to take these surveys every month, every couple of months, and that's a growing trend. So the second thing we look at is who are we going to sample and how we're going to get that group of people. Could be through voter lists, could be through internal databases, or as I said, those opt-in panels that people are creating. Then the third aspect is the questions themselves. What are we going to ask in the survey? And what we don't want is a question that's going to impact the answer. So how do we make sure we're asking a ballot test? Do we ask the issue questions before the ballot test, or does that prime a voter to vote a certain or to give an answer a certain way? So we try to create the ballot test situation as much as we can as what a real ballot test would look like if you go to the polling location to vote. And so we think about the question design, the order of the questions, and then the fourth part is the analysis, and that's the most difficult. That's like your GPS system. Putting in the right coordinates to make sure that we are sampling the population that we think is going to come out on election day. And sometimes we use previous elections to do this. So we might ask people, who did you vote for in 2020? And then weigh the results back against the 2024 polling that you're seeing today. It gets a little more difficult in these primaries because the Republicans really didn't have a primary in 2020. And so to try to weight back by 2020 results in the primary makes it difficult. So those are some of the concerns the pollster is going to have. So we're always thinking about how we're going to collect the data, the modes, the sample how we're going to find these people, the questions we're going to ask them, and then finally the analysis.
So Spencer, polling has come under a great deal of scrutiny, particularly in the last few cycles. And you guys at Emerson have been one of the most accurate pollsters over these cycles. Again, some of that has been when Trump's on the ballot versus when Trump is off the ballot. And we saw starting in 2016, pollsters sort of grossly underestimated the shift that had taken place in the electorate. So talk a little bit about that, about polling in sort of the Trump era. There was this theory initially that, well, Trump voters weren't responding to pollsters. They didn't want to tell them what they actually thought, that they were going to vote for Donald Trump. Is that something that's factored into polling that's taking place these days? And just the general sort of bias that among different types of voters, those who will answer the phone, those who won't, those who will talk to pollsters, those who won't, particularly if you're trying to reach them with a live survey.
Yeah, no, those are some great questions, and I think the overall, thought process here would be don't chase bad polls. We're all going to have a bad poll, and the problem is that you're trying to correct for that bad poll on the next poll, and that's where we sometimes see the pollsters make those mistakes, and we've made those mistakes as well. Regarding the Trump vote, it's been fascinating to watch over the last 8 years. So remember, he comes out in 2015 and very low back in June, May, and June. And by October, we had him winning Massachusetts over 50%. We had him up in Florida. So it really wasn't a surprise at the end when he catapults in November, December into Iowa and then slowly takes over the nomination in 2016. But generally speaking, all of the polls at that time undercounted the Trump support. He performed better than the polls. Same thing in the 2016 election. He performed better than the polls. What we're seeing this time around is he's performing very well in these polls. Some of the latest polls out there, you've got Trump, in Georgia. I don't know if there's a poll that's got Biden winning. Michigan, we might be the only poll in Michigan that's got it with Biden up. Everyone else has got Trump up by. So what we're seeing is a difference. So if there was a shy Trump vote in 2016, we're not seeing a shy Trump vote in 2024. And the question is, are we seeing an overinflated Trump vote in 2024, which might end up coming back? So lots of movement there. But we've, with the Trump voter over the last 8 years in what they're willing, I guess, to tell pollsters. But remember, there's also the modes of data collection. Almost every one of these pollsters now have moved away from using just live operators. There might be some live operator component in their data collection, but they're also using the panels, they're using the opt-in systems, the text messaging. So it's a little bit less invasive, and maybe people are more comfortable giving their opinions in that way.
All right, one more sort of technical question before we get to your latest survey where you oversampled young voters, and that's a big part of this election, sort of an emerging storyline that could be a real issue for the Democrats in November. But, you go back to cell phones, right? This has been one of the things that pollsters have had to deal with, the transformation from landlines to cell phones. And then you've got also, people who, it's hard to keep track of cell phones. Everyone's got their cell phone from, they've got an area code from maybe where they lived 10 years ago or where they grew up. They take their cell phone with them. Now they're living in Massachusetts. How do you know when you're dialing someone where they actually are and how that fits into your modeling? And is this, how does this work in terms of when you're trying to project the electorate? Young people answer their cell phones. They basically spend all their time on the cell phones. But as you get older, maybe some folks aren't answering their cell phones, or some people may not even have cell phones, although probably not very many. So talk about the how you deal with the cell phone phenomenon over the last few years.
So right now, the cell phones, it's a self-regulated industry within the telephone companies. So the government really hasn't stepped in yet and have any regulation. So what we have something that's called 10 DLC regulations. We didn't have this back in 2020, so you were getting more unsolicited text messages from unknown sources. Now, pretty much every text message you're going to get, if it's a poll or an advocacy, the source has got to be registered with the phone companies, or they don't generally send them out. So there's an improvement there in the self-regulation aspect. But to your point, I'm getting text messages to my mother's name because when I got my cell phone 25 years ago, it was signed under my mother's name, and Verizon refuses to change that. And so I know that they've got the wrong person that they're soliciting. So what do we do as the pollster? Not to give away too many of our secrets, but we know exactly where you're taking that survey. So you might be out of state, you might be traveling, and we've texted you, and you're in Tennessee, we want New Hampshire opinions, and you take it. I see exactly where that cell phone, where you've taken that survey from. They give me your geospatial location. So if you are in Tennessee or if you're in these other states, we can kick you out. Sometimes we see folks in another country. Now, that doesn't mean you're not traveling, so we have to keep that in mind. And then we also have voter lists that we can append to. But this is something that has to be constantly evolving because, as you mentioned, who's coming into the arena? Younger voters. And they, as you mentioned, have cell phones, and they are all over the place. And then you've got that sticky group of student voters, and they're at different universities and colleges around the country. And again, it's a very difficult group to capture, which is why we see a lot of the online polling where you have these panels of people that have been brought in, or you're paying incentives to younger people to take the surveys in order to get their opinions.
All right. So speaking of younger voters, your last poll, which was conducted in early December, oversampled younger voters to get a sense of, not only what they're feeling about the current election, but how they consume data. Tons of fascinating insights in there. So give us your sort of top line takeaways. What did you learn about younger voters and the way that they are viewing things these days?
If I could just step back for one moment, Tom, the reason we went to the younger voters is, remember our study we did back in early October of the Midwest, and we did 22 states, and Real Clear was working with us. We worked with the Midwestern Journal, a couple of other folks. And one of the takeaways we saw in all of the data was these younger voters were moving away from Biden. And we said, hey, this 22 states, we're not talking about 2 or 3, this was a clear trend. So we said in our next poll, we've got to oversample and better understand what's going on with 18 to 29-year-olds. This is a strong Democratic voting bloc, but it doesn't look so strong right now in 24. So as you mentioned, we oversampled this group with 800 18 to 29-year-olds, 400 18 to 24, an additional 425 to 29. And the 18 to 24 is still voting pretty heavily for the Democrat. Normally it's 2 to 1. They're voting by about 20, 25 points. The 25 to 29, it's about tied with Trump. So Biden is very close there. And that should be a group that he's up by 15, 20 points. So now you got to ask the question, why? Why are these voters switching or not voting for Biden this time around? And maybe we think it's abortion. Maybe we think it's some social issues. There's certainly, so we asked an open-ended question. We usually ask the close-ended question. But again, in question design, we decided to ask these younger voters the open-ended question before we asked the close-ended question on what's their most important issue. And what we found was 46% of them said economy was their most important issue. It could be inflation, it could be jobs. And so now things like threats to democracy, it's somewhat of an issue for them. It's around 5%. Foreign policy is more of an issue for them. They're more concerned about the Hamas-Israeli conflict war at this time. And so climate change is right around 4 or 5%. But overwhelmingly, it's the economy. And then when we ask them the question, are you have better opportunities than your parents, it's 75% say no. And most concerning about this group is the level of anxiety. We asked them some psychological questions about worry and anxiety, and they rate almost twice as much anxiety and worry as those participants over the age of 40. So perhaps in time, they will lower their anxiety and worriness. But right now, this group is very anxious, and perhaps that's why they're shifting.
Another fascinating thing that I saw in the survey is that you mentioned the 18 to 24 group. They're still voting overwhelmingly, I think, for Biden or for the Democrats in general. But those who are coming into the system who haven't voted before are seemingly breaking for Donald Trump. That shocked me.
Well, it shouldn't shock you because we're seeing this now in every poll. This is not just the Emerson poll. You go look at the CNN poll. They found the same thing in Michigan and Georgia. So they're finding it at the micro level. We found it at the macro level when we looked at the whole country. We're like, hey, this is kind of weird. The new voters, and so the Democrats are usually really good at voter recruitment and registering new voters. There seems to be some difference. It would be interesting to know if the Dems have shifted their registration, programs, or if the Republicans have shifted theirs. But it seems like that new group of voters are and remember, the new voters are generally younger voters. There are some minority voters that come in later in the process, but generally speaking, it's the younger vote. And so them switching over to the Republican Trump. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that we asked the generic congressional ballot test, and the Democrats, I think, are up by like a point, but amongst younger voters, they're up by 15 points. So amongst these younger voters, they're up by a couple of points between Biden and Trump, but you put in a generic congressional. So there may be a lot of ticket splitting in 24 to keep an eye on, particularly as we think about the Senate and a couple of the gubernatorial elections.
I also wanted to ask you, you found Trump leading by, I think, 4 points in this poll. And this is something that we're seeing now with a bunch of other polls as well. When you add in extra candidates, the third party candidates, it's RFK Jr., could be Joe Manchin, Cornel West, Jill Stein, etc. Trump actually, even though his vote share declined, he actually expanded his lead. And that's something I think the conventional wisdom, Spencer, was that when you add in more candidates, that would draw more votes away from Donald Trump. That's not what's happening, at least for right now.
Once again, the conventional wisdom was wrong. But to me, I never saw that happening. The Trump vote is so locked in, and it's been locked in what are in our numbers for years. We're not just talking about, after the last indictment where you saw some of the polls shift. Before that, we've always had Trump up 30, 40 points in these national polls. So we did not see that. We saw that the Trump vote is out to vote for Trump. The Biden vote is, and we've asked these questions, they're more likely to vote for Biden because they're against Trump than they're necessarily voting for Biden. It's the opposite for Trump. Now, some people are voting for Trump because they dislike Biden, but more people are voting for Trump because they like Trump. And so the more of these third-party candidates, and we saw this with Cornel West early because he was the original third-party candidate, the Green Party candidate. And who did we see leave Biden? Young African-American voters. We're not talking about 5%, we're talking about 2%, but that's enough to swing an election. And so you notice how West was taken off. He switched. He left the Green Party. Now Jill Stein's on there. And the real question is who's really going to be on the ballots in each one of these states next November? Each one is a ballot process. So Jill Stein will be on the ballot as the Green Party representative, but these other candidates, they still need to get signatures and ballot access around the country to become formidable candidates, even Kennedy. And so even the Kennedy idea was that as the anti-vax candidate, he would be able to pull some of that Trump vote. And even early on in our polling, we weren't seeing that, certainly not at the proportions that we were seeing, that other pollsters were seeing it at.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating. As you mentioned, ballot access is going to be huge. And they may not get on a bunch of ballots, but where do they get on? Do they get on in Michigan or Pennsylvania or Georgia? Some of these states where it could be decided by just a few thousand votes could make a huge difference. I also wanted to ask you, in your poll, and we've seen this again replicated in poll after poll after poll, you mentioned economy is number one issue by far, order of magnitude above basically everything else. And if you add in some people separate out, inflation versus jobs. Some people just have it like a big bucket, the economy. How detrimental is that for Joe Biden? Because again, are there any lessons learned from 2022? Heading into that election, the economy was the number one issue by far. You had far worse economic numbers. Inflation was at 8.5%. Gas prices were about $5 a gallon. And the Democrats, for a variety of reasons, candidate quality, you mentioned abortion earlier, some other things, did not pay at the ballot box. They did not pay at the ballot box for these terrible, terrible economic indicators. So is it going to be different this time around because Joe Biden is on the ballot and he's seen as more responsible? Or will voters maybe do what they did in 2022 and cut him a break for, again, variety of reasons? Because maybe Trump's the alternative. Maybe, who knows what else might pop up. But, that's something that, again, we just lived through this where the economy was the number one issue. Every voter said that to every pollster who asked. And yet at the end of the day, it didn't seem to have the effect that you would have expected, historically speaking.
Yeah, outside probably Florida and New York, everything else went counter to against conventional wisdom once again. So when we are looking at those elections, I think you look at the abortion issue and to a lesser extent the marijuana policy, you're going to see a couple of states put this on the ballot. That drives out some of that younger vote. But the question is, will that younger vote stick with Biden, or will they split their ticket and just vote on the abortion issue and say, listen, I'm not comfortable with 4 more years of this policies? And that's where that young vote is. They're not excited about what's happened, and Biden's going to have to create some excitement in that camp because, as we noticed in the polling, there's ticket splitting. It's not like they're blaming all of the Democrats. It seems as if they're just blaming Biden and giving the other Democrats more of a pass, in which case that's good news for like a Sherrod Brown or a Tester, but we'll see, obviously, how that plays out as the elections come to a boil. My biggest concern is that we're not going to be talking about policies or issues, that it's going to become more of a scorched earth style campaign, which is going to be very intense for America to swallow. And I think we've already seen the beginning of that, and we're still, 10 months out, 11 months out from the election at this point, and I think it'll get more intense.
I think you're right about that. Okay, we're going to leave it here for this morning. Spencer Kimball, Director of Polling for Emerson College, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Tom, it's my pleasure. Thanks again for having me.
And thanks for joining us on the first edition of our new podcast, RCP Poll Position. You can find us here on the Real Clear Polling website, or on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Once again, thanks for listening. I'm Tom Bevan for Real Clear Politics.